Hello, this is Jay McCarthy with PrimeVault for our architecture series. Today we'll be talking about the concept of signing intents. Now, in a lot of custody solutions, the primary thing that is signed is a transaction. So a transaction is a particular set of bytes that, when signed and submitted to a blockchain, will do something meaningful with your key. If you start from a transaction, then one of the difficulties of talking about key authorization and the policy under which things get signed is that there may be details inside of that transaction that are difficult to understand or access. For example, take a DeFi transaction. A DeFi transaction is just going to have a big blob of data. So what a DeFi transaction looks like is that, it's signed by you. It has some address it's being sent to. That's the smart contract that the DeFi call is for. And then there's just a blob of data. I'm simplifying things a little bit because sometimes really DeFi transactions are made up of multiple blockchain transactions. But anyways, then this blob of data, it has to be decoded and inspected to decide if a transaction should be signed or not. Now, one of the things that makes PrimeVault different is that in addition to being able to sign transactions directly, you can instead give the vault and its policy engine data that it will use to produce a transaction for you. The reason it can do that is because when it's being run in the standard operating mode, it has access to your entire key. So it doesn't need you to produce any signatures, and it doesn't need you to produce information about the wallet. It just has all that itself. And so, for example, you can give it information that will cause it to produce the ultimate transaction. The simplest example of this to explain is what we call the pre-authorized transaction table. So the way that the pre-authorized transaction table works is you basically submit a CSV file, a spreadsheet, where each row is the details of a different transaction. Each row basically says, here's a transaction that I want to do. And typically you'll say that you want it to be done at some point in the future. So for example, you might know all of the distributions of your token that you're going to make throughout an entire year. Because you know that you're launching a token and you know that at the beginning of the month, these people are going to be vested in a certain way. And so what you do is you prepare those transactions ahead of time, submit them to PrimeVault, and the policy engine will save that table in its own internal secret memory. And then in the future, you merely need to call it and say, it's now June 7th or March 18th or whatever, and it has been pre-authorized on that certain time signal to produce the signatures that were part of the table. And so this is a really straightforward example of how, rather than only being able to sign transactions, as most of our competitors provide, we can also sign intents, which are larger than transactions. And the policy engine, it can produce these transactions on your behalf. Now, of course, the pre-authorized transaction table is barely more than a transaction because you did have to prepare everything yourself. But the kinds of automations that are possible are wider and more expressive than that. So, for example, one thing that you might want to do is you might want to authorize a sweep where you would say something like, here's a wallet, wallet 10. If the wallet ever has more than $10,000 in it, take whatever the extra is and move that into this other account. That intent is something that you could sign. And then in the future, what you would do is you would send it information that essentially says it's a new day. And because it's a new day, you are now authorized to go look at the balances of my account and generate the sweeping away transaction as necessary, depending on whatever the circumstance actually is. And just like you can sweep funds away, you could also have an automation that fills up funds. So you could make it so you would say something like, um, if this wallet ever has less than $10,000, then put more in from this other account. And those kinds of automations fall under the umbrella of users signing intents as part of your policy, as opposed to your policy only being about transactions that are generated externally by users. And this is a greater form of flexibility. And in particular, what it does is it makes it so that things are much more secure than compared to our customers. So, for example, if you use some of our customers and you want to do these things, essentially you would have to build your own software to use API keys that produce transactions on your end and then submit them. And so now you're left with this challenge of, well, what policy do you impose on that API key? You could impose a policy that says the API key can do whatever it wants. That's obviously the most flexible thing. Or you could try to encode the automation program in two places, in the program and in the policy that you submit. So what you would have to do is you'd have to first write into the policy something like, Well, the API key is allowed to spend $17 if it's sending it to Jay on Tuesday, March 18th, because that's one of the rows in your spreadsheet. Just like, in one of your pre-authorized transaction sets. So you would basically have to prepare the preset of transactions, add all those as policy statements, and then also separately create the automation system that actually submit those transactions. And of course, most of the people who use our competitors are not going to actually do that. What they're really going to do is they're just going to make the API key that the policy engine, which by the way isn't protected anyways, because with our competitor, they're not using enclaves to have verification of what version of the software they're running. They'll just say that the API key can do whatever it wants. And now all of the security guarantees that were provided by the custody provider, they're essentially meaningless because you've just turned them all off by having the API key able to do everything. And then the transactions that are using this API key, worst case scenario, they're written by your new intern who, surprise, they're actually a North Korean spy, or just making mistakes and they accidentally prepare the wrong kinds of transactions. And so basically, by this automation system that's imposed on you by our competitors, you've just negated all of the purported security guarantees that you thought your custody provider was giving to you because of the way you went about automating. And the essential problem was that automation was an afterthought for our competitor. And so you chose them rather than something where automation was built in. Now, with PrimeVault, automation and signing intents has been built in from the very ground up, and it's part of our security and execution strategy at all levels. And that's one of the reasons why we provide a more secure, more flexible, and frankly, better custody solution. Thanks for your time today. I'll see you next time in another episode of the PrimeVault Architecture Series.